Hello and welcome to the Anglican Flaneurs. Today we're visiting a place known as Germany-on-Thames. It's very close to our walk last week in Cannon Street, and this is another example of a walk then leading on to another walk with fresh ideas. So let's go. We've just come down Dalgate Hill and we've come off Cannon Street, passing Cannon Street Tube Station. And now we're just about on Upper Thames Street, and this is roughly where Upper and Lower Thames Street meet. And we're walking under Cannon Street Railway Bridge, and there in front of us is perhaps another vlogger taking some film of a rather nice white Rolls Royce. In 1989, archaeologists digging next to Cannon Street Station by the passage of the River Walbrook found the remains of a building nearly 60 foot long. This discovery turned out to be the guild hall of the merchants of Cologne and dated back to 1175, known formerly as the Steelyard, and that can be seen on Wenceslas-Holler's largely correct map as the Steelyard. Much of the information for this vlog comes from Vic Keegan and the On London website. It's an excellent piece, and I've also used Vic's work for the recent one we did for the tea and coffee trade in the City of London, walking around Cornhill and Bircham Lane and other places. Later, towards the end of the 15th century, this became an enclosed London centre for a German-dominated international trading bloc known as the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League was lauded as a free trade area by those who were part of it, but as a monopoly by those on the outside. At the peak of its power, the League could count on support of nearly 200 towns across northern Europe, and principal English cities or towns would be not just London itself, but would be places like Norwich, for example, would be Boston in Lincolnshire, particularly King's Lynn. I've mentioned that before and we'll go there soon, and places like Ipswich. And the Ipswich connection is something that we mentioned in our two recent maritime blogs on the Port of Ipswich. By 1475, the site had been fully purchased by the Hanseatic League, and its descendants retained ownership of the Steelyard long after the League left London. The Steelyard that we see on the right from the Middle Low German Stahlhof sample yard was the contour of the Hanseatic League in London. Any remnants from the Steelyard were finally sold off in 1852 when the station was built by the South Eastern Railway Company. It is still debatable why the League's London base came to be known as the Steelyard, the most likely explanation being the metal seals that were used to certify the origin of different cloths brought here for export. We're just completing our walk down All Hallows Lane, and soon we'll be turning right into Steelyard Passage. The Steelyard, like other Hansa stations, was a separate ward community. Relationships between the Hansards and the Crown were not always very easy. There were numerous trade wars over the centuries, and we'll go into that a little later. But in exchange for some of the privileges granted by the Crown, the Hansards in the Steelyard had to maintain Bishopsgate, which had the roads that led out to their interests further east in Ipswich, Norwich, Ely and Boston. In 1552, the privileges of the Steelyard were suspended, and this was in part down to the successful actions of the Company of Merchant Adventurers of London, They had residence in Hamburg in 1567, and it became a crucial market for the adventurers after the loss of the Dutch market in the Dutch Revolt. Now, as a result of this success, other Hansa towns became, shall we say, rather jealous, and Hamburg were pressed into closing the merchant adventurers trading post. So, as a result, England responded with countermeasures, and Queen Elizabeth suppressed the Steelyards even more and rescinded its privileges again in 1598. King James I restored those privileges, but the success of the Steelyard was never really recaptured, and most of its buildings were destroyed during the Great Fire of London in 1666. Hanseatic League was never officially dissolved, but from around 1670-1680 it didn't really exist in any meaningful form, though its principal cities, Lübeck, Bremen, Hamburg and Rostock, were still officially known as Hanseatic cities. But in its heyday, and when relationships with the Crown were good, the Consul had its own warehouses on the river, its own alehouse, chapel, counting houses, a guild hall, clothes halls, wine cellars, kitchens and residential quarters. And now we'll briefly look, and very briefly, at the backdrop to the formation of the League. We made mention earlier in the vlog of Cologne merchants building a guild hall in 1157, and Henry II of England granted more privileges to these traders from Cologne some 15-20 years later, an attempt to limit the power of Flemish merchants who then controlled the English wool trade. This group from Cologne effectively controlled the trade of wine from the Rhine and acquired the guild hall to accommodate that. Merchant communities from Westphalia and the Rhineland and from the Baltic formed a joint venture by the mid-13th century. We're now walking by the towers of Cannon Street Station, again explored in last week's vlog. And we can see this plaque unveiled in 2005 commemorating the Steelyard and the history of Hanseatic merchants in this place. In future we'll try and look at more of the Hanseatic connections with England. As I said, in my own hometown of Ipswich there's a strong connection. We'll go up to King's Lynn, as I've mentioned previously, maybe Boston, and when we do another tour of Norwich, which I intend to do soon, we'll also look at its Hanseatic history. And very soon I'll be back in Norwich working on a vlog that will be called The Lost Rivers of Norwich. We've now finally made it to Hanseatic Walk, and we can see great views of the Thames, London Bridge and Bankside. Now a little bit more about the Consul. They were established as a legal entity, and it had its own treasury, seal, code of rules and legal power to enforce rules on residence and administration. Now, part of its primary aim was to inspect the quality of trade goods and to establish diplomacy with local and regional authorities. The Hansards living in the Steelyard were relatively cut off from the rest of London. As we mentioned earlier, they had their own communities, their own rules, their own places of worship, though they did have some property dealings with other Londoners. And the official and only language was Middle Low German, and this was common in most of the dealings of the Hanseatic League. Very shortly you'll see a plan of the Steelyard from Johann Gustav, and this was as it was in 1667. We can still see in some of the old Hanseatic cities that sort of that proud history recreated, and we can see that in the emblem of the football team Hansa Rostock, who play in the second tier of the Bundesliga. And Hansa Rostock were the last winners of the old East German Oberliga in '91. And we've also dropped in the signage and a picture of the Hansa House in King's Lynn. We've now just crossed over into Oystergate Walk. I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of Germany-on-Thames, the Steelyard just underneath the railway bridge at Cannon Street. And we'll leave you with one last panorama of this area of London with some excellent views of the Thames and also of the Oyster Shed. I'm not stopping for a beer, but I've been in there before. So that's it. It's goodbye from the Angling Flaneurs. We hope to see you again soon.